I'm going to begin with a question for all of you, but a specific question for each of you. You have all three done a brilliant job of drawing out promises from process thought and ways of being, promises that promise to contribute to the common good. My question is, how do you respond to the warnings that also come out of process thought and ways of being? Such as the warnings that as the process of the universe continues on, we can expect an increase in complexity, but that complexity may not be toward truth, beauty, and goodness. That complexity might be to an increase of evil. And how do we address that challenge from process thought? So, Tim, my particular question for you is related to your own commitment, which I share, to communal living devoted to non-dualistic ways of being. What do process warnings communicate to you about the dangers that might come out of communal living, even when it is committed to non-dualistic ways of being? And I think in particular, for example, of cults that have turned to really destructive communities for the individuals in them and others.
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. I'm reminded of an email I got recently from a minister who I work with up in Santa Barbara who was asking a similar question of, you're talking about value, you're talking about beauty and its power and allure, but there also seems to be a power and allure to fascistic movements and different, oppressive hegemonic forces in the world. And how are we to discern which we should go with, because they're both attractive in some sense to human beings. And I think if we take an honest look at history, we have to acknowledge that that's the case, and also postulate that that could be our future as well, to have to notice the force that's at play. And so for me, I tend to always come back to beauty. And although Whitehead acknowledges the tragic nature of beauty and its passingness, and for me, I think what communities can discern is whether or not the heart and mind that is central in a community is evoking and enacting beauty. So in response to this email I got, I said something like, I could imagine the power of something like the Nazi movement being so alluring in its scope that folks were sort of drawn into it, even though it's the complete opposite of beauty, it's evil, and how if we have an attuned radar to get a sense for whether or not communal actions are actually promoting the common good, promoting liberation, promoting beauty, I think we can fine-tune our ability as small religious communities or as a society of moving with questions of what's most beautiful for most. So for me, I kind of come back to that often, and obviously there's a subjectivity to what beauty is and its wider coordinations, but for me it's about those kind of discernments, I think.
I find that fascinating, and it makes me think of Elaine Scarry and her book Beauty, in which her central thesis is that beauty begets beauty. Yeah. A thesis worth diving into in light of what you just said.
Thank you.
Tom, my question for you relates to the Eucharist. You've painted a beautiful picture in elegant language of the meaning of Eucharist and its potential in connecting peoples and all aspects of creation, its potential in fostering justice. what warnings might come from process thought as to the difficulty, the resistances to those changes you're advocating, and the difficulty in making those changes, are cultivating what you're describing is a totally fresh way of understanding. It's not absent from Christian history. It's very much present, but it has not been the dominant explanation or ethos, which has been more individualistic, focused on individual salvation, including even elements of fairly harsh judgment and violence at points. So how do you respond to the warnings that come from process thought?
I'll slide this direction. Thank you. I think one of the things that is really important in process, especially the recognition of complexity, is the encouragement then, even as it is a warning and a challenge, the encouragement to not let the one simple, possibly elegant description be the final description, that there is work that needs to be done to make it so, that there's continual discernment to pay attention to, both in how we theologize about the Eucharist and in how we practice it and its implications and live into the community of the table. I think one of the major warnings that process has with the Eucharist is we can get really focused on the takedown of substance-based metaphysics. And don't get me wrong, I'll do that with you all day long. It's a lot of fun. But we can get lost in our own abstractions over and over and over. And as Whitehead encourages us, we've got to land that plane at some point and then take back off. And I think one of the warnings that I heed very greatly is the warning to landing the plane and coming back up, that our work has to actually touch the ground. We actually have to practice the Eucharist. We have to celebrate it. We have to eat together. We have to recognize the people we're eating as well as the people with whom we're eating in our experience of the good news. And that is a challenge to those of us who find this an attractive model. Because individual salvation that is handed out from the priestly vending machine is a much easier thing to do, right? It's a much easier plane to get up and land.
It's very helpful, and one warning from Whitehead would be minds in a groove, that people approach the Eucharist with minds in a groove. And you're suggesting ways in which you might move out of those grooves. And it's complicated.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. And Timothy, your centeredness on good news is very powerful. You really keep the center in your paper. And my question for you, and you emphasize proclamation of the good news. So my question for you is, what might be the limits of proclamation? What do you mean by proclamation? And are there resistances to proclamation that will make this not just a work over centuries, but a work infinite, that never gets resolved, so that good news comes to be in its fullest?
Thank you for that. I am not trying to narrowly define proclamation as a verbal assent. I actually can get quite frustrated with all the right words, and then someone doesn't actually do anything or have any meaningful relationships with those communities that they're in, say that they care about. And so proclamation, it existed in like one little, like 2 words. I said verbally or actively or practically. So as you know, how you live your life with others and who you're accountable to, and who you're accountable to, and not just individuals but communities and so forth. And so good news is expressed not simply verbally. So I'm not going with a logocentrism. And in other places, I just called it affirming planetary value. Wherever it is denied, what will help that experience be experienced as affirming good news? And words alone may be necessary often, but they ain't sufficient, not even close. And without presence and solidarity, I'd rather someone not say the right words than to say them and not be engaged with others.
That's very helpful also, and I want to push you just a little bit further. Indigenous writers who are involved in activist ecological projects and who are writing about ecological civilization, ecological change, often advocate for something more like what Tim is talking about in terms of people needing to move way beyond words in trying to address ecological crises and to find ways to draw from indigenous wisdom of living close to Earth, living in and with community, and for community, and that until that happens, the conversations that take place in boardrooms about policy will never actually change.
100% agree with that, in that I'm going to create a dualism, because you just have to sometimes when you're speaking, because you can't say everything at once. But I would much rather, and I'm much more convinced that people live their ways into different ways of thinking than they can think their ways into different ways of living. And so agree. And my criticism of certain aspects of process sensibilities is it often feels like a type of idealism that if we just say the right worldview or metaphysic, then the world will change. But we still have the same oppressive power relationships in how we're actually living. And I would much rather live our way into thinking differently and then have a better metaphysic to help us understand these new insights in how we're living.
Helpful, yes, please. No, I'm going to turn it to all of you now. I would love to hear you address one another in whatever ways you want to before we open to everyone else. And I want to make sure to leave some time.
5 minutes.
Address each other quickly, please.
Oh, we can swing it that way. Yeah, I think Andrew, let's swing it to anyone else who has questions. Yeah.
Actually, there are microphones around. So is that okay with all of you?
Is that okay?
That's fine.
Yeah.
I think we're fine just to leave.
Yeah.
There are microphones around, so please, your questions, comments.
Just a few minutes, friends.
Thank you all. Very stimulating presentations. My question is for you, Thomas.
Do you mind holding the mic?
Yeah, can you hear me better now? In regards to the Eucharist and the attention we can bring to our eating, I thought of Whitehead's lines in Process and Reality that life is robbery.
Yeah.
The robber needs justification. When we eat a meal, it's not just about what we're eating, it's about who we're eating, and
Right.
You're constantly referencing non-human people, right? And so how does the ethics of eating factor into this Eucharistic conception of the church's role, and how might it change not just how we eat together and what we believe it means, but what or who we are eating?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's the next question, right? And so one of the things that I think, and I am really influenced here by Bob Neville, his thought on the way that blood, wrestling with blood sacrifice happens in religious systems, and recognizing that for us to live, something or someone dies. And part of being religious is dealing with our own solitariness in all of our relations. And so part of our being religious is dealing with what it means to cut off one of our own relations. And Christopher Carter, Claremont grad, Christopher Carter is really influential for me here too, with thinking about Black veganism, that we then, when we recognize that, you're killing lettuce just as much as you're killing a cow to have your meal, are you naming the value of lettuce as a person in God's own life? That when we begin to actually peel back layers of food ethics, the Eucharist, I think, gives us an opportunity to encounter every other person in a way that recognizes our entanglement, so that the vegan lifestyle that promotes, eating Oreos, because Oreos are vegan, that promotes eating Oreos and grapes from Chile and avocados controlled by drug cartels in Sinaloa, and lettuce harvested by migrant workers who are effectively enslaved, that may not be as holy of a life as going out with the men's group from church and killing a deer on Saturday and processing it and making that meat available in your church's pantry for the next month. And so wrestling with not just who we're eating as an individual, but the Eucharist also calls us to then recognize who all of those people have been shaped by and touched by. And I think Christopher Carter then challenges us to say, okay, look at factory farming. Is factory farming as holy of a system for the vegan lifestyle as indigenous practices of living with the buffalo and other than human people that way? So, and it gets super complex. Thank you.
Do we have time for two more? We need to cut it now? Okay. I'm sorry that we were only able to take one question from all of you, but thank you very much for your presence here. I hope the conversation continues in the hallways. And the three of you have not only offered us a lot of richness that we will continue to ponder, but you've also stirred questions. So thank you very, very much.